Hello and welcome to Zoology 142, Lecture 1, the Endocrine System. In this lecture we'll talk about the endocrine organs as well as the various hormones they produce and the different methods in which they are regulated. Before we talk about the endocrine system, it's important that we review a little bit about the nervous system, because both the endocrine system and nervous system send messages to organs using different types of methods. Within the nervous system, we send messages principally by electrical impulses called action potentials. These action potentials are generated in the axon hillock of a neuron, and they travel extremely fast, at the order of a few milliseconds to go from one end of the body to the other. On the other hand, information between neurons or between neurons and effector organs like muscles is exchanged via something called neurotransmitters. Now these are chemical signals that diffuse from one cell to the other, but because the distance is so very small, they happen almost instantaneously. In contrast, the endocrine system uses exclusively chemical messengers. These chemical messengers are called hormones. Hormones tend to travel much more slowly than electrical impulses, and they do take a while to have the effect on their target organs. However, even though the endocrine system does not rely on electrical impulses, it does interact with the nervous system. If you remember, the hypothalamus was the command center for the autonomic nervous system and is likewise the command center for much of the endocrine system. Hormones help to regulate several different processes in the body. For example, thyroxine or thyroid hormone helps to regulate our basal metabolic rate. There are also different hormones that help to regulate our biological clock or wake-sleep cycles. Some hormones such as oxytocin also affect the contraction of smooth muscle and help to set the timing for processes like labor and delivery. Other hormones affect glandular secretion, while still others, like growth hormone, affect growth and development. And finally, the process of reproduction could not happen without various hormones, estrogen, testosterone, and others. So hormones are extremely important in the homeostasis of the human body. Finally, it's important to note that hormones are extremely potent chemicals. That is, they have a very powerful effect even when present in very, very small concentrations. Before we go on to talk about the endocrine organs, it's important that we make a distinction between the terms endocrine and exocrine. Exocrine literally means out of. Exocrine glands have a tube or duct which connects them to a body surface. For example, sweat glands and sebaceous glands or oil glands secrete their products through the tube leading to the surface of the skin, and these secretions will reach the surface and therefore lubricate the skin and also reduce body temperature. On the other hand, endocrine glands are found buried deep within the body, and they do not have tubes that connect them to a body's surface. So they secrete their products directly into the interstitial spaces, and those products, known as hormones, will eventually diffuse through the interstitial fluid and into the bloodstream, and that is how they will eventually reach their target organs. Before we go on to talk about the various types of hormones produced throughout the body, let's do a major overview of the different types of endocrine glands we can find in the human body. The first of these, known as the pineal gland or epithalamus, secretes melatonin. Melatonin is important for circadian rhythms or daily wake and sleep cycles. Another endocrine gland found in the brain is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, if you remember, was the command center for the autonomic nervous system. It's also the command center for much of the endocrine system. In addition to secreting nerve impulses that control various endocrine organs, it also secretes releasing hormones which help to control the anterior pituitary. So if the hypothalamus is looked at as the president of the endocrine system, the pituitary would be the very important vice president. The pituitary gland, although it's very small, secretes and manufactures over 9 different types of hormones. The pituitary is divided into anterior and posterior lobes, each of which work very, very differently. Once we get outside the brain, the next important gland is known as the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is found on the surface of the trachea or larynx, and it is important for secreting hormones that deal with metabolism, as is the case with thyroxine, and also for secreting hormones that are important in calcium homeostasis, for example, calcitonin. Calcitonin lowers blood calcium and puts that calcium back into the bones. Located on the backside of the thyroid gland are the parathyroid glands. Remember, para means other than or outside of. The parathyroid glands are very minuscule, insignificant-looking glands that have an important role in calcium homeostasis. Like calcitonin, they regulate blood calcium, but they regulate it in the opposite direction. Whereas calcitonin causes blood calcium to decrease, parathyroid glands causes blood calcium to increase. So these two hormones are antagonists. The thymus gland is found on the surface of the heart and secretes hormones which are important in the maturation and development of certain types of white blood cells known as T lymphocytes. The adrenal glands are found on the surface of the kidneys. The adrenal glands secrete the hormone adrenaline, otherwise known as epinephrine or norepinephrine. This is important in the fight or flight reaction. Also secreted by the adrenal glands is the hormone cortisol, which helps to reduce inflammation, raise blood glucose, and help the body deal with stress. The pancreas secretes hormones which are important in setting the blood glucose levels. This includes insulin, which lowers blood glucose, and glucagon, which raises blood glucose. These two hormones, since they work in opposite direction, are called antagonists. The gonads, or ovaries and testes, are also very important endocrine organs. For example, the ovaries secrete two hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen helps to promote secondary sex characteristics that we associate with females, for example, breasts and hips, whereas progesterone maintains the uterine lining during pregnancy. The testes, in contrast, produce one hormone known as testosterone. Testosterone is important in the maturation and production of sperm, and it's also important in the production of male secondary sex characteristics such as body hair, increased muscle mass, and catabolism of body fat. Testosterone also plays a role in aggression. Now that we've learned about the various endocrine organs in the body, let's take a look at how hormones get from their endocrine glands to their target tissues. Remember that endocrine tissues are scattered throughout the body and that endocrine glands don't have any direct connection to their target organs. Instead, they secrete their products, known as hormones, into interstitial fluid, and they diffuse through the interstitial fluid and are eventually picked up in the bloodstream. The bloodstream will then help it travel towards the target tissues. Target tissues are other tissues in the body that have specialized complementary hormone receptors. The magnitude of the effect that a hormone has on its target tissues will depend on the ratio of hormone to receptors. So there are two different ways to increase the function of a hormone in the body. The first of these methods is just to simply increase the amount of hormone produced. For example, if we want to lower blood sugar a lot, we can simply produce twice the amount of insulin that we were producing beforehand. Another method would be to produce more hormone receptors on our target cells. This concept is called upregulation. So even though we have the same amount of hormone, that hormone will be interacting with the receptors more often because there are more receptors on the target cells. Either of the two methods will increase the effect of the hormone on the target tissue. We could also turn the situation around. Imagine, for instance, you have an endocrine gland that for whatever reason is only secreting half the amount of hormone that it regularly did. This would reduce the effect that it had on the target tissues. Or imagine that you had an endocrine gland that was secreting the right amount of hormone, but for whatever reason the target tissues only had half the number of receptors. This process is called downregulation. Again, the effect would be the same. The hormone would have half the effect it did with the normal amount of receptors. We'll talk more about upregulation and downregulation later on when we talk about endocrine disorders. The majority of hormones that we'll be talking about in this lecture are circulating hormones, that is, hormones that are produced in distant endocrine glands. These hormones diffuse throughout the interstitial fluid and hop a ride on the bloodstream until they reach their target cells. On the other hand, there are also local hormones called autocrines or paracrines. Autocrines are hormones that are produced and have an effect on the same cell. Remember, auto means self. So if you take a look at the picture at the bottom of the screen, you can see a cell that's producing a hormone, and that hormone is binding to the receptors on the outside of the same cell. This would be an autocrine. On the other hand, paracrines are hormones that are produced by one cell and have an effect on a nearby adjacent cell. So you can see in the middle picture where the cell on the left is secreting the hormone, it's traveling across the gap to get to the cell on the right and binding to receptors there. That would be an example of a paracrine hormone. There are two different chemical classifications for hormones. The first classification are lipid-soluble hormones. These hormones are either composed of a lipid, for example cholesterol, or soluble in lipids. Because they are composed of lipids, many require a protein carrier in order to travel throughout the bloodstream. Remember that the blood is primarily water and that fats or lipids don't dissolve readily in water, so lipid hormones require a special protein carrier to get to the bloodstream. Once they get to their target tissues, however, they can pass directly through the cell membrane because it too is made of a lipid, that is a phospholipid. Examples of lipid-soluble hormones include our steroids, estrogen and testosterone, as well as nitric oxide and thyroid hormones. In general, the lipid-soluble hormones are going to be the ones that are produced by both the gonads, the ovaries and testes, and also the adrenal glands. Pretty much everything else is going to be a water-soluble or protein hormone. So the second class are our water-soluble hormones. These are mainly composed of proteins or amino acids. They dissolve freely in the blood, but they are unable to cross the cell membrane of their target tissues because they're simply too large to move through the phospholipid bilayer. So examples include amine-based hormones, as well as peptide hormones, full proteins, the glycoprotein hormones, and also the eicosanoids. So an example of a water-soluble hormone would be insulin. Insulin is a small-chain hormone composed of about 51 amino acids, and it's produced by the pancreas and helps to regulate blood sugar. At this point, we should consider how we can get extra hormone into the body in case there's a deficiency. This will depend on whether the hormone we're trying to supplement is either lipid-soluble or water-soluble. For example, if we want to give somebody a lipid-soluble hormone like estrogen or progesterone, we usually give it to them in a pill form because estrogen and progesterone are not readily broken down within the stomach, and much of it is absorbed by the time it gets to the intestines. On the other hand, protein hormones or amino acid-based hormones like insulin are easily degraded with the stomach acid and enzymes in the stomach so that little will be around once we reach the small intestine. Therefore, it's very difficult to supplement people with protein-based hormones using an oral route. In the case of insulin, we actually have to inject insulin into the patient directly in the bloodstream, or more recently we've been able to administer insulin through insulin inhalers. The take-home message is that the chemical composition of a hormone will greatly influence the way in which we can get it into the body. This diagram just reviews how lipid-soluble hormones can travel throughout the body. On the left is our endocrine cell, or our source tissue, which is producing our lipid-soluble hormone. That hormone diffuses through the surrounding tissues but must be carried by a protein carrier in order to enter the bloodstream and travel to the target tissue. Once at the target tissue, the lipid-soluble hormone can move easily through the phospholipid bilayer because it itself is made of a lipid. Once inside, it will alter the response of the target tissue according to the function of the hormone. Now let's take a look at the same process, except here through a water-soluble hormone. So one of the examples I already gave for a water-soluble hormone was insulin, and insulin is produced by the pancreas. So imagine the endocrine cell at left was in the pancreas, and this endocrine cell is producing insulin. Insulin is an amino acid hormone, so it diffuses easily in the interstitial fluid and eventually in the bloodstream. It needs no special protein carrier to make it soluble. Once it gets to the target cells, however, it cannot cross the phospholipid bilayer because it is just too big. Instead, it binds to a complementary receptor protein on the outside of the target cell. Once it binds to this receptor, a second messenger will be released on the back side of the receptor, which will travel towards the nucleus of the target cell and modify transcription and translation, thus modifying the cell's activity, similar to what we saw in the previous slide. It's important to note that hormones can and often do interact with one another. These interactions can be divided into one of three categories. Permissive effects occur when a second hormone strengthens the effect of the first hormone. For example, thyroid hormone strengthens the effect of epinephrine on fat breakdown or lipolysis. Another type of effect is a synergistic effect. Remember, synergy means working together. So a synergistic effect is where two hormones work together for a greater effect. For example, in the female reproductive system, both estrogen and luteinizing hormone are needed for the production of a mature oocyte or egg. And finally, another type of interaction is an antagonistic effect. Antagonist means working against. So these are two hormones with opposite effects. For example, insulin is a hormone that lowers blood sugar by favoring the formation of glycogen within the muscles in the liver, whereas glucagon raises blood sugar by favoring the breakdown of glycogen within the liver. So these two hormones have opposite effects, so therefore they're called antagonists. Just like other systems of the body, the endocrine system is maintained by the process of homeostasis. And like other systems of the body, that homeostasis most often acts through negative feedback. This is a type of feedback that quickly reverses a change in a controlled condition, sending us back to set point. For example, there's certain set points for the amount of testosterone in the body, the amount of thyroid hormone or thyroxine in the body, and also the amount of blood glucose. So anytime something pushes us away from this set point, the endocrine system will work very quickly to bring us back down towards the original set point. There are only a couple of examples of positive feedback in the endocrine system, and we will talk about those primarily when we get to the reproductive system. We will not discuss them in this chapter. Now we're going to go back and take a closer look at the major endocrine organs and the hormones they produce. Before we do, it's important to remember that the hypothalamus is the control center or command center for the endocrine system. It is also the link between the nervous system and the endocrine system, and it receives input from the cerebral cortex and the limbic system as well as the thalamus. It also controls the pituitary gland, which is sometimes called the master gland. The hypothalamus and pituitary gland together regulate virtually all aspects of growth, development, metabolism, and homeostasis in the body, so they're very important regions of both the brain and of the endocrine system. So let's go take a look at the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is also known as the master gland because it secretes over 9 different hormones. It is composed of 2 lobes, an anterior lobe, that is a lobe that faces closer to the face, and the posterior lobe, or a lobe that's closer to the back of the head. In general, the anterior lobe tends to be larger and hang lower than the posterior lobe. Both lobes are controlled by the hypothalamus, which contains special cells called neurosecretory cells. These cells have both an endocrine function and a nervous function. That is, they transmit nerve impulses, but also secrete hormones. The anterior pituitary or adenohypophysis secretes 7 different hormones. These include human growth hormone, HGH, thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, and the gonadotropins, FSH and LH, which act on the gonads. Also included are prolactin and MSH, or melanocyte stimulating hormone. Secretion of these hormones from the anterior pituitary is stimulated by endocrine signals from the hypothalamus, known as releasing hormones. In order to understand how the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary communicate, it's best to take a look at the anatomy of these neurosecretory cells. At the top of the screen, you can see that the neurosecretory cells are limited to the hypothalamus. That is, they do not extend into the anterior pituitary. The little red dots that you see are releasing hormones. Releasing hormones are how the hypothalamus talks to the anterior pituitary. These releasing hormones travel down the axons of the neurosecretory cells and eventually catch a ride in the capillaries. These capillaries transmit the releasing hormones to the anterior pituitary, where they signal the release of the complementary hormone. For example, the little blue dots here could be the hormone growth hormone, whereas the little red dots would be the hormone growth hormone releasing hormone, which is produced by the hypothalamus. So big picture here is that the hypothalamus talks to the anterior pituitary through the use of releasing hormones. Now let's take a look at the posterior pituitary. The first thing you should notice is that the neurosecretory cells here are very long. That is, they extend from the hypothalamus all the way down into the posterior pituitary. The next thing you should notice is there are no little red dots. Remember, the red dots in the previous screen symbolized releasing hormones, and it was releasing hormones was the method that the hypothalamus used to talk to the anterior pituitary. So there's no releasing hormones here. Instead, the hypothalamus communicates with the posterior pituitary using nerve impulses. The little blue dots you see are actually the hormones that are secreted by the posterior pituitary. These are not really even made in the posterior pituitary, but instead they are made in the hypothalamus and transmitted to the posterior pituitary through slow axonal transport. So the big picture here is that the hypothalamus talks to the posterior pituitary using nerve impulses, and that the two hormones secreted by the posterior pituitary are actually made in the hypothalamus. So the big picture here is that the posterior pituitary doesn't actually make any hormones. Instead, it stores two hormones that are originally produced in the hypothalamus. These include the hormones ADH and oxytocin. ADH stands for antidiuretic hormone. If you remember back to medical terminology, when we talked about diuretics, you should recall that a diuretic is something that helps you to pee. For example, caffeine and alcohol are both fairly good diuretics. We would use a diuretic on a patient if, for example, they were hypertensive and we wanted to remove some fluid from their bodies and reduce blood pressure. On the other hand, your body will secrete antidiuretic hormone when it is dehydrated or blood pressure is falling. The target tissues here are primarily the kidneys, and it helps to stabilize and prevent further water loss from the body so that blood pressure will not drop further. The second hormone here is called oxytocin, and it stimulates the contraction of smooth muscle both within the uterus and the myoepithelial cells within the mammary tissue. In the uterus, it is an important hormone for setting the timing of pregnancy as it stimulates the first contractions during labor. In the mammary tissue, it stimulates the myoepithelial cells surrounding the alveoli in the breast and is responsible for the milk letdown reflex. At this point, you might be asking yourself, well, if men don't have breasts and they don't have a uterus, do they actually have oxytocin? And the answer is unequivocally yes. In fact, oxytocin actually has a third function, and I would like you to look that up on the internet. So stop what you're doing right now, open your Google search, and type in oxytocin. The picture you see here is called the neuroendocrine axis, and basically it's a diagram of the chain of command between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland and all the other endocrine glands in the body. If you remember, the hypothalamus is not only the command center for the autonomic nervous system, but it's also the command center for much of the endocrine system. It talks to the pituitary gland using either releasing hormones, as is the case for the anterior pituitary, or nerve impulses, as is the case for the posterior pituitary. In turn, the anterior pituitary gland will secrete one of 7 different hormones, including human growth hormone, TSH or thyroid stimulating hormone, the gonadotropins FSH and LH, as well as prolactin and MSH or melanocyte stimulating hormone. When stimulated with electrical impulses, the posterior pituitary will secrete either ADH, antidiuretic hormone, or oxytocin. Both of these hormones are produced in the hypothalamus but simply stored in the posterior pituitary. Okay, now we're starting part 2 of our lecture on the endocrine system. In this lecture, we will focus on the various functions of the pituitary hormones, as well as hormones produced by other glands in the body. At the end of the lecture last time, we talked about the neuroendocrine axis, but this is a chain of command between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland and the other endocrine glands that the pituitary gland controls. The hypothalamus talks to the anterior pituitary using releasing hormones. For example, if we want to secrete growth hormone, the hypothalamus would secrete growth hormone releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary would secrete human growth hormone. There are 7 different hormones secreted by the anterior pituitary. These include human growth hormone, which as the name implies is responsible for growth but also glucose metabolism, TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, which is responsible for stimulating the thyroid to produce thyroxine, which is necessary for metabolism, and the gonadotropins FSH and LH, which stimulate the ovaries and testes to produce testosterone and also to produce gametes. Remember, the word tropin indicates that the hormone is acting on another endocrine gland. For example, the gonadotropins are acting on the gonads. The hormone prolactin, abbreviated PRL, is responsible for stimulating milk production in the mammary glands, and the hormone MSH, melanocyte-stimulating hormone, is responsible for pigmentation of the skin. The posterior pituitary doesn't actually make any hormones, but it does store two hormones that are made in the hypothalamus. These are ADH and oxytocin. ADH helps to conserve water in the body when you are dehydrated, and oxytocin stimulates the contraction of smooth muscle both in the mammary glands and also in the uterus. Remember that the hypothalamus communicates with the posterior pituitary via nerve impulses, not via releasing hormones. In the next several slides, we're going to go on to talk about the functions of various pituitary hormones in greater detail. As we do, we'll also talk about endocrine disorders associated with each one of these hormones. Most of these disorders can be traced to either having too much of a hormone, or hypersecretion, or having too little of the hormone, known as hyposecretion. It is also possible to have just the right amount of a hormone, but not have enough receptors to respond to it, and this is called receptor insensitivity. Now let's take a closer look at the hormones produced by the posterior pituitary. Remember that these hormones are actually made in the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary. One of these hormones is the hormone oxytocin, otherwise known as Pitocin. The target tissues for oxytocin is going to be the smooth muscle within the uterus and also within the mammary tissue. During labor and delivery, it is oxytocin that stimulates the uterine muscles to contract. And after delivery, oxytocin is responsible for what's called the milk letdown reflex. It stimulates the contraction of muscle within the myoepithelial cells in the breast tissue, and this contraction forces the milk out towards the nipple. Even though men don't have uterus or breasts, oxytocin is still very important in them. In both sexes, oxytocin is also known as the cuddle hormone because it's responsible for pair bonding and bonding between offspring and parent. If you want, you can do an internet search and read a little bit more about this fascinating hormone, oxytocin. The second hormone secreted by the posterior pituitary is called antidiuretic hormone. It is also known as vasopressin. Remember that vaso means vessel and pressin causes constriction. So vasopressin causes constriction in blood vessels, thereby raising blood pressures. So one of the functions of antidiuretic hormone is to raise blood pressure, but also to conserve water in the kidneys and to reduce sweating. ADH is secreted in response to dehydration. Remember, the hypothalamus is monitoring blood osmolality, and as you become dehydrated, the saltiness or osmolality of your blood increases, and therefore the hypothalamus will stimulate the posterior pituitary to secrete more ADH, and this will help the body to retain water and prevent further dehydration. The secretion of ADH is based on humoral stimuli. Remember that humor means liquid, and here we're talking about the body's main liquid, the bloodstream. As the body becomes dehydrated, the concentration of electrolytes and other salts in the bloodstream increases. This high osmotic pressure stimulates the hypothalamus osmoreceptors. The osmoreceptors activate the neurosecretory cells that synthesize and release ADH. Nerve impulses travel down these neurosecretory cells to the posterior pituitary, and in response, the posterior pituitary secretes ADH. ADH travels through the bloodstream to its target tissues, including the kidneys, sweat glands, and arterioles. This causes the kidneys to retain water, the sweat glands to stop sweating, and the arterioles to constrict, thereby raising blood pressure. With this in tow, we should eventually restore the blood osmolality to normal. For example, if you start to drink water, the blood osmolality will go down. At this point, we'll go up to number 5, and at the low blood osmotic pressure, we will inhibit the osmoreceptors within the hypothalamus. And this inhibition will cause the neurosecretory cells to stop sending nerve impulses to the posterior pituitary, thereby restoring homeostasis. Now that we've covered the functions of the two posterior pituitary hormones, let's go back and take a look at the anterior pituitary hormones. Remember that the anterior pituitary manufactures and secretes 7 different hormones. One of these is HGH, or human growth hormone. As the name implies, human growth hormone stimulates growth in the body cells. It acts principally on the liver, which stimulates it to secrete something called IGF, or insulin-like growth factor. Together with the growth hormone, IGF stimulates amino acid uptake in cells and ultimately stimulates cell growth and reproduction. It also stimulates lipolysis, or fat breakdown, and also raises blood sugar. In children and adolescents, HGH is an important hormone in stimulating growth. If, for example, you have a child that doesn't seem to be growing up to their potential based on their age, you can actually ask your doctor to administer HGH. Over a period of time, this can actually add inches to your child's height. On the other hand, if you were to take HGH as an adult, you probably would not grow any in height, as the epiphyseal lines in the bones have already sealed up. It would, however, help you put on more muscle mass and also develop thicker, stronger bones. HGH is often used by bodybuilders to help put on extra muscle and also shed extra fat. As I mentioned at the beginning of lecture, sometimes we can have too much of a hormone, known as hypersecretion, or too little of a hormone, known as hyposecretion. For example, dwarfism is caused by hyposecretion of growth hormone during early childhood and adolescence. As a result of this hyposecretion, people do not grow to their full height potential. On the other hand, gigantism is caused by hypersecretion of growth hormone during childhood and adolescence. As a result, the person may be much taller than normal, over 8 feet in height. Another endocrine disorder involving growth hormone is acromegaly, otherwise known as acromegalic gigantism. This also results because of hypersecretion of growth hormone. However, here it is because of hypersecretion in adults. At the photos to the left, you can see a girl that's probably in her young 20s with normal body proportions. In the middle picture, you can see it's the same person, but now she's in her 30s. How does she look different? She has a wider nose, broader chin, and also a more protruding brow. And finally, at the very right, you see the same person who's now in their 60s. You can see that the fingers are very, very large in diameter, the chin is very broad, as are the cheekbones. People with acromegalic gigantism don't get any taller because at the time of the hypersecretion, their growth plates are already fused close. However, the bones can grow in width, and this is called appositional growth. Both gigantism and acromegaly are usually caused by a pituitary tumor, which causes hypersecretion of growth hormone. Another hormone produced by the anterior pituitary is TSH, or thyroid-stimulating hormone. Thyroid-stimulating hormone, as the name implies, stimulates the thyroid gland. This stimulates the thyroid gland to secrete T3 and T4, otherwise known as thyroxine. Thyroxine is a very potent metabolic hormone which helps to set our basal metabolic rate. In order to make thyroxine, the thyroid must combine thyroglobulin, a colloid-like compound, with the element iodine. The thyroglobulin is manufactured within the follicles of the thyroid gland. You can see these at the bottom right. Remember that a follicle is simply a sac of epithelial tissue that is secreting something. Here this epithelial tissue is secreting thyroglobulin. It's important to note that without the iodine, we cannot make functional thyroxine. So if you can imagine somebody that is not getting iodine in their diet, their pituitary gland would continue to stimulate the thyroid to secrete thyroxine using thyroid-stimulating hormone. However, without the iodine, all the thyroid could do was to manufacture more and more of this thyroglobulin. If this continues without any iodine, the thyroid gland can in fact become very enlarged, leading to a condition called goiter. Goiter is quite rare in the United States now because we have adequate amounts of iodine in our diet and also supplement iodine in various things such as table salt. Before we move on, it's also important to point out that the thyroid is also responsible for secreting something called calcitonin. Calcitonin is one of the principal hormones which help us to regulate calcium balance in the blood. Calcitonin and thyroxine are secreted in different areas of the thyroid gland. The follicular cells secrete thyroglobulin, which will eventually be converted into thyroxine, whereas the parafollicular cells secrete calcitonin, which is used in calcium homeostasis. Like most hormones, the secretion of thyroxine is regulated by negative feedback. Here, however, we're not monitoring something that's dissolved in the blood, rather we're actually monitoring the concentration of the hormone thyroxine in the bloodstream. So this monitoring occurs at the hypothalamus. If the hypothalamus detects low levels of thyroxine in the bloodstream, it will secrete TRH, or thyroid-releasing hormone. This will travel via blood capillaries to the anterior pituitary gland, which will be stimulated to secrete TSH, or thyroid-stimulating hormone. The TSH will travel to the thyroid follicles and stimulate them to release thyroxine. This will lead to elevated levels of thyroxine in the bloodstream, and these elevated levels of thyroxine will circulate back to the hypothalamus and also to the anterior pituitary. Here they exert their negative feedback, shutting off both TRH and TSH. This ensures that we have adequate but not too much thyroxine in the bloodstream. However, sometimes the negative feedback mechanism governing the release of thyroxine does mess up, and this is where we can get Graves' disease. Graves' disease is caused by hyperthyroidism, that is, hypersecretion of T3 and T4, otherwise known as thyroxine. This leads to rapid weight loss and decreased BMR, an enlarged thyroid, and protruding eyes, known as exophthalmos, as well as ocular edema. It appears that the reasons why this hyperthyroidism occurs is that abnormal antibodies in the bloodstream mimic TSH and therefore inappropriately stimulate the thyroid to secrete thyroxine. There are very few treatments for Graves' disease, but one of which is to ablate parts of the thyroid gland or insert radioactive seeds which will destroy many of the follicular cells and therefore reduce the amount of thyroxine secreted in the bloodstream. Located on the back of the thyroid are 4 small pea-like organs known as the parathyroid glands. The main function of the parathyroid glands is to secrete parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone, along with calcitonin, helps to regulate the levels of calcium in the bloodstream. Remember that we need calcium in our bloodstream to make muscles contract and also for nerves to fire off nerve impulses. The way that parathyroid hormone works is by stimulation of osteoclasts. Remember, osteoclasts were the cells that eat or break down bone. As they eat or break down bone, they free up calcium, which is put in the bloodstream. They also free up magnesium. Parathyroid hormone is an antagonist of calcitonin. That is, parathyroid hormone tends to elevate blood calcium, whereas calcitonin tends to reduce it. This picture shows the negative feedback mechanism governing the release of parathyroid hormone and calcitonin in the bloodstream. Let's start at number 1. Imagine that you've just eaten a calcium-rich meal, and so you have high levels of calcium in the bloodstream. This is going to stimulate the thyroid to release calcitonin. This calcitonin release is going to trigger the osteoblasts to build more bone and inhibit osteoclasts. So the net result is that calcium is deposited in the bone and taken out of the bloodstream. Now let's go over to number 3. Imagine that you have not had any calcium in your diet all day long, and yet your body is using calcium for muscle contraction and also for nerve impulses. These low levels of circulating blood calcium will stimulate the parathyroid glands to secrete parathyroid hormone. The parathyroid hormone will travel to the bones where it will stimulate the osteoclasts to break down bone and free up more calcium for the bloodstream. It will also trigger the synthesis of something called calcitriol. This will stimulate increased reabsorption of calcium in the kidneys and prevent its loss in the urine. Together, parathyroid hormone and calcitonin are both important in regulating calcium homeostasis in the blood. However, parathyroid hormone is the most potent and therefore most important of these two antagonistic hormones. The next anterior pituitary hormones we're going to talk about are the gonadotropins, FSH and LH. Remember, they're called gonadotropins because these are hormones that affect other endocrine glands, that is, the gonads or ovaries or testes. The first of these is FSH, which stands for follicle-stimulating hormone. Within the female reproductive tract, FSH stimulates the oocytes within the ovary to grow and develop. It also stimulates sperm production in the testes of men. Remember that like other anterior pituitary hormones, FSH is secreted in response to releasing hormones. The releasing hormone triggering FSH is called GnRH, or gonadotropin releasing hormone. The next of our gonadotropins is LH, which stands for luteinizing hormone. This hormone stimulates ovulation in females and also stimulates the production of the hormone progesterone or progestin. In males, it stimulates the production of testosterone from the Leydig cells, otherwise known as the interstitial cells. Like FSH, the secretion of LH is governed by the releasing hormone GnRH from the hypothalamus. We'll be taking a closer look at the pituitary gonadal axis that governs these hormones later on when we talk about the reproductive system. The next hormone secreted by the anterior pituitary is prolactin. The name of this hormone literally means go milk, and it stimulates the breast to produce milk. Prolactin is inhibited by a compound called prolactin-inhibiting hormone secreted by the hypothalamus. However, when an infant suckles, this will reduce the amount of prolactin-inhibiting hormone and therefore promote prolactin secretion and continued lactation. Now that we've discussed the pituitary gland and the various hormones that it secretes, we're now going to go on and look at the other endocrine glands of the body. The first of these are the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are located on the superior surface of the kidneys, and the adrenal glands can be divided anatomically into an outer cortex and an inner medulla. The cortex of the adrenal glands produces several different hormones, all of which are known as corticoids, whereas the adrenal medulla secretes the hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine, otherwise known as adrenaline. The adrenal cortex is divided into three different zones, each of which secretes different types of hormones. The outermost zone is known as the zona glomerulosa, and this primarily secretes mineralocorticoids, mainly aldosterone, whereas the middle zone is known as the zona fasciculata. This secretes glucocorticoids such as cortisol. And finally, the deep zone is known as the zona reticularis, and here's where we secrete androgens. We're now going to go through each of these zones and the hormones that they secrete in greater detail. Remember, the outer zone was known as the zona glomerulosa, and this secretes mineralocorticoids, and it's principally involved in regulating ions that are in the bloodstream that may end up in the urine. The principal example here of a mineralocorticoid is the hormone aldosterone, and the target tissue for aldosterone is principally the kidneys. There it helps to increase the reabsorption of sodium and chloride. And remember that dissolved substances in the bloodstream are called solutes, and basically solutes suck. They tend to draw water towards them. So if we are conserving ions like sodium and chloride, we are therefore also conserving water volume. So increases in aldosterone help to maintain blood volume and boost blood pressure. They also help to excrete potassium and hydrogen ions through the kidneys. The production of aldosterone is stimulated by either a drop in blood pressure or a rise in blood saltiness, otherwise known as osmolality. We will learn more about the negative feedback mechanism governing aldosterone release when we get to the urinary system. The next group of hormones are the glucocorticoids, and these are produced by the zona fasciculatus of the adrenal cortex. Think about what the name glucocorticoid means. Corticoid meaning coming from the cortex, and gluco meaning sugar. As the name implies, glucocorticoids, like cortisol, help to regulate blood sugar. So cortisol is what we call a stress hormone. It's secreted at times of physiological stress, and it helps to elevate blood sugar and also reduce inflammation. It has very potent anti-inflammatory effects, and it's for this reason that drugs containing glucocorticoids like prednisone and hydrocortisone are used to treat swelling and inflammation. The secretion of cortisol from the adrenal cortex is stimulated by production of ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, from the anterior pituitary. This in turn is stimulated by the production of CRH, corticotropin-releasing hormone, from the hypothalamus. Let's take a closer look at the negative feedback system governing the secretion of cortisol from the adrenal glands. As I indicated earlier, the hypothalamus is the command center of the endocrine system. It monitors most, but not all, of the hormones circulating in the blood, and cortisol is no exception. When levels of cortisol in the bloodstream drop below set point, the hypothalamus will secrete corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH. The CRH will travel to the anterior pituitary. This will in turn stimulate the anterior pituitary to secrete ACTH, otherwise known as adrenocorticotropic hormone. Remember, a tropic hormone is a hormone that has an effect on other endocrine glands. In this case, it's going to have an effect on the adrenal cortex. The adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates the adrenal glands to secrete cortisol. Cortisol has many target tissues in the body, including the liver and also muscle. It stimulates something called gluconeogenesis, that is, production of new sugars. And cortisol is a hormone that's produced in times of stress, and the goal is to free up as much glucose as possible for the brain, because the brain cannot run on amino acids and it cannot run on fats. As the plasma levels of cortisol rise, these will have a negative effect on both the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. Specifically, they will shut off the production of CRH from the hypothalamus and ACTH from the anterior pituitary. As with the thyroid gland and pituitary gland, it's possible to have endocrine disorders that affect the adrenal glands. Cushing's syndrome is an adrenal disorder that causes a hypersecretion of glucocorticoids, principally cortisol. This results in a redistribution of fat throughout the body. Basically, you get somebody that has this large moon face and possibly a fatty hump on the back. The skin doesn't heal very quickly, and it also bruises easily because remember, cortisol tends to reduce swelling but also depresses the immune system. Cushing's syndrome can be caused by a tumor on the pituitary gland or a tumor on the adrenal glands. However, more often than not, the cause of Cushing's disease is iatrogenic. That means it's caused by treatment. Specifically, it's caused in cases where a physician may be overprescribing glucocorticoids like prednisone to a patient to combat inflammation or inappropriate immune response elsewhere in the body. If cortisol or its derivatives are used for too long or at too high amounts in the body, this can in fact induce Cushing's syndrome. Another type of disorder affecting the adrenal glands is Addison's disease. Addison's disease is caused by hyposecretion of cortisol, and it results in hypoglycemia, muscle weakness, low blood pressure, and dehydration. It also mimics the skin darkening effects of MSH. And in fact, it was rumored that President John F. Kennedy had Addison's disease. The treatments for Addison's disease are actually pretty easy. We can administer oral prednisone or oral cortisol to people that have lower than normal levels of glucocorticoids and restore homeostasis. Another hormone produced by the adrenal cortex is the androgen DHEA. DHEA is partially responsible for body hair and other secondary sex characteristics. It is also responsible for libido in females. The secretion of DHEA is stimulated by adrenocorticotropic hormone from the anterior pituitary. Now let's take a look at the adrenal medulla and the hormones that it produces. Unlike the adrenal cortex, the adrenal medulla is not controlled by the pituitary gland. Instead, it is controlled by direct nerve impulses from the autonomic nervous system and hypothalamus. The two hormones produced by the adrenal medulla are epinephrine and norepinephrine, otherwise known as adrenaline. These are hormones that amp you up. They increase your blood pressure, they increase your heart rate, they increase the heart contractility. They also constrict your blood vessels to raise blood pressure, and they dilate your pupils and dilate your airways. So they are essentially hormones that get you ready to deal with an emergency. In the hospital, we use epinephrine to help revive people that have gone into cardiac arrest. We can also use epinephrine to ward off an allergic reaction. For example, in the bottom picture, you see somebody that's using an EpiPen. You would use an EpiPen if, for example, your throat started to close up and your airways were constricted. This epinephrine would cause massive amounts of bronchodilation very, very quickly and therefore bring you back into homeostasis. Now let's go take a look at the pancreas. The pancreas is not only an endocrine organ, but also an exocrine organ. That is, part of its job is to produce hormones, while another part of its job is to produce digestive enzymes that help to break down our food. The pancreas itself sits within the loop of the duodenum, which is part of the small intestine. And a lot of times you'll look in textbooks and they show it as looking as this like ear of corn type thing. But in truth, if you ever see a pancreas on a cadaver or in an animal cadaver, it looks more like a wad of chewed up Wrigley spearmint gum. So it's very, very easy to miss. As it turns out, the majority of tissue in the pancreas has an exocrine function. That is, it's there to make digestive enzymes. The hormone-secreting cells are limited to small capsules of tissue called the islets of Langerhans. Within the islets of Langerhans, we can find 4 different types of cells. The top 2 are the most important. The alpha cells secrete the hormone glucagon, which helps to increase blood glucose levels during times of fasting, whereas the beta cells secrete the hormone insulin, which helps to decrease blood glucose levels after you've eaten a meal. Because insulin and glucagon worked in opposite directions, we say that they are antagonists. In the next few slides, we're going to take a look at the negative feedback mechanism governing blood glucose homeostasis in the body. The graph pictured here shows blood glucose levels on the y-axis and time in hours on the x-axis. If the endocrine system is working properly, blood glucose is normally at a level around 90 milligrams per deciliter during fasting. This is what we call the set point. After you eat a meal, particularly one with lots of carbohydrate in it, it is typical for your blood sugar to rise. At some point, the increase in blood glucose will trigger an increase in the secretion of insulin. Insulin causes the body cells to take in sugar, which in turn causes the blood glucose levels to go down. Once the blood glucose levels approach set point, insulin secretion will taper off. This is a classic example of negative feedback. Remember that under negative feedback, the body will try to reverse a change in a controlled condition and bring it back to set point. So after the meal, our blood glucose went up, but insulin helped to bring it back down and restores back to set point. Now let's imagine you've been running around all day and haven't even had time to eat. As you might imagine, your blood glucose at some point would begin to drop below set point. At some point, this drop in blood glucose would trigger a compulsory increase in glucagon secretion from the pancreas. Glucagon causes the liver and also muscle cells to break down glycogen and release glucose into the bloodstream. In other words, glucagon causes blood sugar to increase. Once blood sugar reaches the set point, glucagon would then decrease its secretion so that we can maintain our set point of 90 milligrams per deciliter. One of the main endocrine disorders that can affect the pancreas is diabetes mellitus or diabetes mellitus. This is a group of disorders caused by an inability to produce or use insulin. Diabetes mellitus can be divided into one of two groups. Type 1 diabetes is also called insulin-dependent diabetes because it develops in young children or adolescents because their beta cells that normally produce the insulin have basically been destroyed by the immune system. These people have to take insulin for their entire lives. Type 2 diabetes, on the other hand, is often known as adult-onset diabetes, and this develops because of downregulation of insulin receptors. Most often, type 2 diabetes is developed in people that are sedentary or obese, and it can often be reversed with both diet and exercise. Signs and symptoms of diabetes mellitus include excessive urination, known as polyuria, excessive thirst, known as polydyspia, and also sugar in the urine, otherwise known as glucosuria. In some individuals, they will actually be ravenous, known as polyphagia. Diabetes mellitus can lead to serious complications such as loss of circulation, loss of vision, and kidney disease. So type 1 diabetics basically have to take insulin because they're under a state of hypoinsulinism. On the other hand, if they take too much insulin, they can actually end up with hyperinsulinism. This is because they've taken too much insulin and it's dropped their blood sugar too low, putting them in what we call hypoglycemia or diabetic shock. In most cases, this can be reversed by administering some sugar or sweet foods to a person who has taken too much insulin. The picture you see here shows glucose curves for both a normal person in red and somebody with untreated diabetes mellitus, pictured here in green. We've administered a meal to both populations at time 0. You can see a complementary rise in blood glucose in the bottom figure that goes up to about 125. And then about 2 hours after eating that meal, blood glucose levels are back down at the 90 milligrams per deciliter set point. Now if we take a look at the top figure, you can see when the meal was eaten, our blood sugar was already well over 130 milligrams per deciliter. And after that meal, blood glucose levels shot up to above 200 and stayed high for at least 3 hours. And it was around hour 5 or 6 that blood levels would come back down to around 135, but that's still much higher than the set point of 90 milligrams per deciliter. Now we're going to switch gears and take a look at another endocrine gland that resides within the brain. This would be the pineal gland, otherwise known as the epithalamus. The pineal gland secretes melatonin, and melatonin is a hormone that helps to set our circadian rhythm, that is, our wake-sleep cycles. In general, the levels of melatonin increase in darkness and decrease in daylight. And so it's your melatonin production that helps to set your regular wake-sleep cycles. Unfortunately, your production of melatonin tends to lag behind when you switch time zones. For example, if you fly from Honolulu to Newark, New Jersey, you're going to be all out of whack and waking up at different times of the day until the visual input from your optic cortex begins to sync with the melatonin production in your pineal gland. That is, your pineal gland begins to sync with the optic cortex. At that point, you begin to assume the normal daylight cycles of somebody that lives in that latitude. The last group of hormones we're going to look at are actually paracrines known as eicosanoids. Eicosanoids are secreted and received by almost all cells in the body, and they can be divided into 4 groups, the most important of which are leukotrienes and prostaglandins. Leukotrienes are potent mediators of inflammation. That is, they are produced or released when cells are damaged or destroyed. For example, if you imagine hitting your thumb with a hammer, that's going to release a lot of fatty acids and chemicals which are basically cleaved into leukotrienes, and these leukotrienes cause blood vessels to swell, and they cause inflammation, and as a result they cause a lot of pain. And so we oftentimes try to limit the amount of inflammation after an injury by inhibiting the synthesis of prostaglandins and leukotrienes using non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like aspirin. So aspirin basically blocks an enzyme that helps to convert arachidonic acid into leukotrienes and also into prostaglandins, and thereby prevents their inflammatory effect. In addition, prostaglandins also have other functions. For example, they're important in smooth muscle contraction, glandular secretion, blood flow, and etc. So not all prostaglandins and leukotrienes are bad. Some of them definitely have some very important functions in the body. To close out this lecture, we're going to talk about a phenomenon called general adaptation syndrome, or GAS. This is a sequence of physiological events which occur when the body is stressed. It is initiated initially by the hypothalamus, first through nerve impulses and later through releasing hormones, and it occurs in 3 steps. One is the fight or flight reaction. This is followed by the resistance reaction, and finally followed by exhaustion. We're going to go through each of these steps in a little bit of detail, and at each step you should ask yourself what's happening in the body, what hormones are being produced, and where are we getting our energy. This slide shows an overview of the processes of the general adaptation syndrome. The first step of the general adaptation syndrome is something called the fight or flight response. This is initiated by nerve impulses from the hypothalamus directly to the adrenal medulla. Because the adrenal medulla is hardwired to the brain, this happens very, very quickly. Basically, nerve impulses stimulate the medulla to release massive amounts of epinephrine and norepinephrine. This does several things. First of all, it increases heart rate and increases circulation. It also increases the catabolism of glycogen, thereby freeing up glucose for the heart and for the brain. It also promotes synthesis of new ATP and increases heart rate and cardiac output. Non-essential body functions such as digestion, defecation, and yes, even sexual arousal are basically inhibited. So the fight or flight response is initiated when we are suddenly faced with a challenge that could be life-threatening. For example, if you look in the top photo, you see the guy in one car being crashed into another car. Probably both of those guys have their hearts in their throat and have massive amounts of epinephrine being secreted from their adrenal glands. Also imagine that you're walking down a dark street and all of a sudden you turn a corner and bam, there's this huge Doberman pincer out there, teeth snarling and gnashing, and obviously that's going to get your heart rate up as well. So this is the fight or flight response, and it's initiated from nerve impulses from the hypothalamus directly to the adrenal medulla. Now the fight or flight reaction is very good for a short-term dealing with stress, but it's not going to help us deal with a prolonged stressor. The resistance reaction, basically we enter that for a prolonged stress. It's initiated not by nerve impulses, but by releasing hormones from the hypothalamus. These include CRH, corticotropin-releasing hormone, TRH, thyroid-releasing hormone, and GHRH, growth hormone-releasing hormone. Basically, the resistance reaction happens after we've already depleted our glycogen. Remember, glycogen is a polysaccharide that's found within the liver and also in the muscle cells. And we normally have a pretty good store of this. If you go to run in a marathon, probably the night before, your carb load, eat lots of pasta so that you have plenty of glycogen left in your liver and muscles for the next day. But if you're actually running a full marathon, chances are at some point you will exhaust that glycogen, and that's often what we call hitting the wall. At this point, our releasing hormones from our hypothalamus are then going to switch our energy source to something else. We're going to have increased levels of cortisol, which is going to help to break down protein and do something called gluconeogenesis, literally making new glucose, again for the heart and the brain. HGH is also going to be important in breaking down fat so that we can make more ATP because we're all out of glycogen. So basically, the energy source has shifted from initially being glycogen during the fight or flight reaction to now proteins and fats during the resistance reaction. And we can keep this up for a very long time, but if anyone who's run a marathon can tell you that switching from glycogen to proteins and fats is pretty rough when you're doing it mid-exercise, but it can be done. At some point, this resistance reaction can eventually result in exhaustion. And we're not talking about, oh, I'm tired, but we're talking about physiological exhaustion. And the stage of exhaustion basically happens when our glycogen stores have been depleted, our fat stores have been depleted, so now we can metabolize only our body's proteins, that is, our muscle, our bone, and so on. Prolonged exposure to the resistance reaction can cause this wasting of muscle, suppression of the immune system because of the high levels of cortisol, as well as ulceration of the GI tract, and finally burnout of the pancreatic beta cells. So in summary, stress can have some very profound effects on the human body. It can lead to an increase in blood sugar. It also alters the secretion of several different types of hormones, principally cortisol. It can prolong wound healing time, and it can severely depress the immune system, leaving the body more vulnerable to contagious diseases and even cancers.